And the other pillar is very much about exploration in the moon that can give traction. And it's a bit difficult to really describe the entire portfolio of solutions that you will require, because ultimately, yes, there will be humans going to the moon, but it will be also a lot about robotics, about automation, about autonomy there when we talk about data center, about AI, about autonomy.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. We have a name, a nomination for the next Space Force Chief of Space Operations. The White House has nominated Lieutenant General Doug Schiess to succeed General Chance Saltzman, who is retiring. Schiess earned his undergraduate degree in physics and is a career space operator. He currently serves as Deputy Chief of Space Operations for operations at the Pentagon, where he has overall responsibility for all U.S. Space Force global operations, sustainment, training, and readiness. If confirmed by the Senate, he will be the third Chief of Space Operations in the service's 6-year history. He will also inherit a service that could see its annual budget more than double, and a world where allies are racing to build sovereign space capability. They're doing this not just so that they can better operate with U.S. forces. Often, it is specifically to reduce or altogether avoid depending on the U.S. government or American space service providers. Germany has committed roughly $41 billion to military space and is aiming to build its own sovereign space ecosystem. Poland just signed a deal with Airbus and Thales Alenia Space for its first sovereign military communications satellite. In the United Kingdom, MPs are demanding answers on why their government has shortlisted Lockheed Martin over Airbus for a multi-billion-pound contract associated with the military SATCOM program Skynet. The Times of London said the reason was because Washington has become unpredictable, and the concerns are not just political, they are also economic and security-driven. In July of last year, the Canadian province of Ontario canceled a $100 million Starlink contract, explicitly as retaliation for U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. And in March of last year, Italy froze negotiations on a $1.6 billion Starlink deal for military communications. Not over tariffs, though. It was about doubts about whether Elon Musk was a reliable partner for national security. And Canada just introduced legislation to build its own launch capability because, in the words of its transport minister, quote, "This reliance on the U.S. sends investment out of our country, creates costly delays, and leaves critical infrastructure exposed to decisions beyond our control," end quote. The global space economy is on a trajectory to $1 trillion by 2034. Defense and national security procurements are driving this growth. And so today, many governments are asking, how much of that should they own themselves? And how much do they need to own to ensure the capabilities that they need are there when they need them? To help explain the state of play, I caught up with Pacôme Révillon, the CEO of Novaspace, at this most recent space symposium. Here's our conversation. Hello, Pacôme. It has been years and way too long since I've had the pleasure of speaking with you about space, business, and the forces shaping the marketplace. How are you, sir?
Hi, Laura. Well, I'm doing well. It's been a while indeed, so very happy to be back with you on the podcast. And things have been going well, extremely active, certainly in the last 2 to 3 years since we last spoke in that space domain.
Oh, gosh, a lot has changed. You know, of course, I know your title, but, let's try and bring everybody up to date, up to speed, because things have changed since you were last on the podcast. What does the CEO of Novaspace actually do on a day-to-day basis? What does your multinational, multilingual team provide to its customers?
Well, so Novaspace was born of that merger we did 2 or 3 years ago. So the way I describe the group is very much a global organization aiming at supporting the advancement of space initiatives around the world. Some helping to shaping national space journeys for government, down to supporting the industrial stakeholders or even the financial community. So to help that, we've been building a portfolio of capabilities that we can pick and choose for our clients around the world. So, and certainly that brings us to be in touch with clients in over 50 countries on an annual basis.
I'd like to note that you have also recently opened an office in Bangalore, right? I mean, that's the heart of India's space sector, home to the Indian Space Research Organization and the nation's new space economy. If I'm not wrong, I think the office opened in November of 2025. So who exactly are your customers there?
That's correct. We opened just a few months ago, so we've certainly have had regular contacts, exchanges, cooperation with a set of stakeholders in India, including up to the National Space Agency ISRO. So obviously, the fact of having a local team in that space power and with its ambitions bring us in a much better position to connect with the entire ecosystem, from really some of the national strategic ambitions down to the fast-growing ecosystem of startup organizations or larger group taking positions now in space with what's possible today and what is to build for India in cooperation with all their foreign partners. So I think we're here to support locally, but also we bring that capability of being in connection with stakeholders around the world to support some of the local stakes.
Now, the biggest reason that I personally am so pleased to have you back is actually the very fact that you are not American. And yes, I know you have tons of clients here in the United States, many clients, but that's not really what I'm after from you, because I want a non-US global perspective, because we Americans can be a bit myopic, and it's actually pretty hard not to be recently because of the success of the Artemis 2 mission. So, we Americans are kind of banging the drum, and that's cool. But we do need to have a different perspective. And that is what I'm really happy to have you here for. So, speaking of the Artemis 2 mission, how was it received outside of the United States? Who's really paying attention to that mission?
Oh, I must say, this as a mission is still very much a global event. So I can even testimony on behalf of some of our people would have been in Europe or other places that they have followed it from the beginning through the end. It's still a first of a kind in terms of distance, really, and first time that there is that, human flight up to the moon, paving the way for what's next in terms of going to the moon. So it was still a very important milestone in terms of the adventures to space. And somehow, clearly with NASA's leadership and around the Artemis programs, it certainly paves the way also for contribution from other nations to the program. So there are shifts, there are challenges attached to it, but at the same time, as an event, and the fact, let's take it the way it is. The fact that the mission has been successful is still a highly risky endeavor and so forth. So it's a pretty dramatic event if you look at it that way. So the fact it's been a success is certainly a key milestone in what's coming next. So it's just one step further, a critical step. But I think it's been received around the world by the many nations. It's quite interesting because India had its big moment where they could land on the moon with a rover. That was something huge for the country,
huge.
but even had resonance around the world. And the Artemis 2 successful mission is even a bigger thing, but has had a global impact, no question about it.
Well, let's talk about impact real quick. You were at SAT Show, saw you there.
Yeah.
And you remember when the announcement came out from NASA and from the NASA administrator about Gateway and all that. And I don't need to go over that particularly again. I'm actually quite interested in looking to the future into those, how should I say, subsectors, space subsectors like ISAM, OSAM. And for everybody who's listening, that's in space assembly and manufacturing, or on orbit assembly and manufacturing, depending upon which term you want to use. But there are going to be all these technologies that are going to be necessary for NASA and its Artemis partners to be able to achieve a permanent lunar base that is human rated. And I'm kind of wondering if that might, in your mind, kickstart some of these subsectors that have been
I hate to say this, but yeah, struggling to kind of, get to the next point.
Sure. No, if you look at everything being in orbit built or in orbit logistics or various capabilities you bring, I think there is a need, as for any kind of industry, there is a need to have critical applications or things that will drive the progress of the industry and give it visibility to invest as well in the private sector. And to be honest, I think the two pillars here, some of those capabilities could be used for national security purpose in some places. Many things are dual use in space. And the other pillar is very much about exploration in the moon that can give traction. And it's a bit difficult to really describe the entire portfolio of solutions that you will require, because ultimately, yes, there will be humans going to the moon, but it will be also a lot about robotics, about automation, about autonomy there when we talk about data center, about AI, about autonomy, but also bringing information back and forth to have a distant control from Earth here. And indeed,
And to have energy for all this activity,
you need energy.
right?
And you can carry goods to the moon, but there is no way you have everything at hand as you would have on Earth. So how you could build some things you will need to have up there and or repurpose them or change them will be part of the game for a permanent presence, especially.
Now, a lot of that is going to initially be achieved through contracts from commercial space service providers and governments. Mostly, of course, NASA, but other governments that are also going to be involved with this. And that brings me to something I know you and others have been saying a lot recently, actually over the past 12 months, and that is that the space market is maturing. And I have to admit that I feel like I'm a bit of a pill on this point, because I always thought that market maturation was really a reflection of how the market works, that instead of a national government being the main customer for services, that for a mature market, that it would be mostly business to business or business to consumer. And, I just sort of feel like that hallmark is missing, honestly. So I'm kind of pushing back on that. So what is your definition of this market maturation? Like, what do you really mean by that? Because the word is it's not clicking with me, man.
I would agree with you, not disagree. So I think the fact that government investment will continue to play an absolute key role and an anchor tenant in space most of the space activity. You can find some pockets of growth, especially in telecom or others, where you have a large commercial sector. But the truth for the moon, but many other capabilities, government will remain central. So that being said, there are two ways to look at maturation of the industry. You could look at it indeed at what the end customers could be in the long term as a sustainable business. The other part of the equation is also about that move that people refer to new space, still referring to, or startups, whatever, started maybe a decade ago. And many organizations now are 8-10 years
Some have
history.
real space heritage.
So now they have heritage, they have a real service now. They start getting revenues, have demonstrated their case. And we also, at the same time, which is very normal in any innovative industry, a number of financial transactions, M&A, reshaping of the industry. So from that standpoint, and it's not over yet or complete at all, but we see that kind of maturation where some players still start to reach a first level of critical size and become kind of new established space businesses, and the rest still is building up. So I'm not saying that, honestly, I don't believe the core space industry will be financed 80% by the private sector anytime soon. For most of the space capabilities, government will remain central for many of them, either defense or civilian. But the kind of maturity of the supply chain, transformation of the supply chain as it's been in the last 10 years, we'll see more players now be on the stage where it's more about operations at initial R&D/first development to have a concept in space.
And going again, focusing in on the government side of things, and you also mentioned defense. You yourself have said that defense and sovereignty are now the dominant market drivers, and that dynamic is expected to persist well into the late 20s. ESA just secured a record budget, 26 billion euros for 2026 to 2028, roughly 30% more than the previous cycle, but they said sovereignty a lot, right? And you've got the Germans and the German military and what they've also put out as a policy, and that's $41 billion US dollars. And, sovereignty is all over these policy papers. But I want to ask you candidly, because you advise governments across more than 60 countries, including defense clients, how much of what you are seeing from those clients is genuine long-term strategic ambition that is sovereign? And how much is reactive anxiety about American reliability?
So I think first, sovereignty is like a word covering a myriad of realities. So sovereignty, as I would describe it right now, is the right level of autonomy or control you want to have in the context as it is, in terms of what you need to do with space for your nation at this point in time. So if you look at the reality of the world, there are obviously some of the leading space powers, the US, in a prime place. And you have countries that are now just users of some satellite services. And maybe for them, sovereignty is already owning a remote sensing satellite. So that one they control, that one they task when they want. This information is theirs. They can do whatever they want with it, or they can use it to trade with partners. And for nations that had nothing, it's a certain level of sovereignty or autonomy. They can't build a system, but as they own it, and assuming they consider they have sufficient suppliers to buy from several countries or nations, that may be for them a right level of sovereignty right now, a better one compared to where they were. So I think that notion of sovereignty depends very much on where you stand in the space journey. I think that the first very key concept around sovereignty as we see it around the world.
And would it also not also be really important about how much their government communications, I'm not just talking about defense, but government, whether it's national or internal security services or, other things as communications with the general population even, to have that as a sovereign system would give you some resiliency, I would imagine.
But I think that there are several aspects. First is, yes, the agenda has become, or the horizon has become shorter for many nations. Obviously, geopolitics as they are, the risks are what they are, and you may consider you may have to take various levels of actions, engagement in a relatively short term, which is even a bit lower than the traditional cycles of developing maybe long-term space capabilities. So you have that kind of pressure. Shall I acquire? Shall I bid? What the right level of autonomy now for myself? And that being said, space, because of what it can deliver, is also more and more of a tactical tool as opposed to a strategic long-term support. And then you need to take action quickly. So there is a question on who you could rely or depend on maybe to access to some capabilities, but also how much time does it take me to get there if I need to seek a series of approvals, discussions, negotiations, maybe to get something. And the truth is, which is the nature of the world, if I have some capabilities myself, information, etc., I'm also in a better position to trade with a third party. Maybe I have that type of capability, you have that one. So I don't know, I have optical imagery, you have radar. Maybe we can find a way to do something together, which is a better position than not having any capability. So I think this is that kind of transformation we see right now. And again, sovereignty applies everywhere, but what the definition is very much dependent on each nation.
Well, let me just take this a little bit further.
Yep.
And this thought came to me from somebody who is pretty well known in the launch community. And I told this person that I was speaking to you. So this person said, well, I want to know, I want to hear him talk about this. I'm like, all right. So like the most concrete version of sovereignty would be access to space, right? So SpaceX, though, dominates global launch capacity, and much of the world is a customer. Governments, commercial operators, agencies, they are really dependent on a handful of launch providers, and in many cases, a singular one. So what does that dependency actually mean for sovereign ambitions like we were just discussing? Because you can't have a satellite and trade in the way that you're talking about unless you can get it up there. And there seems to be a growing backlog, a possibility for backlog for heavy lift. So, people trying to solve this?
But, so partly, yes. So again, it depends what you can do yourself. And I think if you look at history of space, it's been almost always with various scale, but it's been always that perception of possible oversupply for a bit of time, but at the same time, you can very quickly fall into scarcity because you realize there is just one source missing, even in the supply chain. Let's see after the pandemic how difficult it was to get some of the equipment, systems, etc. that you may need, or the US that needed an international party to bring astronauts for several years. So suddenly things can change. So right now, for sure, there is dependency, especially on heavy, super heavy launchers from company like SpaceX or the other parties here in the US. So, and there is
Ariane
not to
did
be
do a successful launch, but I haven't.
But it's a matter of scale. So how much
Okay.
do you want to launch? And depending on what you want to launch, what do you need to have as a launch capability? Because the truth is, and I think it's a trigger right now, is my plane to constellation? Is my plane to large size constellations? Do I want to send to space dozens, hundreds, thousands, etc.? So what is the scale I need to have in my operations? And what is the acceptable level of dependence on third parties? I mean, when you talk to defense, it's very much about some of the core requirement and augmentation with allies and augmentation with commercial, and how much am I ready to defer to third party who I can trust enough because that's sufficient for what I need. So it's a bit the same challenge. I'm sure some nations would want to have more capabilities of access to space, at least for small satellites or just to heavy launchers. Then what capability you really want to have, because you could have a super heavy launcher and launch a lot of times, but then you need to have the satellites you build to do that, or otherwise it does not make any sense to have that capability. So it's a bit of a global system that you have to bring together. And that's where at the moment, not so many alternatives in the rest of the world, but can you launch enough or at the economic investment you're ready to make, and then you may still leverage on third parties because at the moment there's still that possibility. And that supply chain also exists in other type of systems or components in the space domain. Is your supply chain diversified enough that maybe some sources are national, some are not, but all in all, you consider that at this point in time, it's acceptable or it's a reasonable trade-off or risk to take?
Speaking of risk, and I promise you this will be the last one that's really focused on sovereignty, but I also think that we're missing something in the conversation about sovereignty, and that's the flip side of that script, that with this push for sovereignty, there's a fragmentation of supply chains, because if you're a nation like Germany, you're trying to create a national supply chain. Here in the United States, we have, reshoring, onshoring of certain industries, again, to make everything sovereign. But we have a very global economy, and we have very global supply chains. And so I kind of wonder that with this fragmentation of what had been a very globalized supply chain economy ecosystem, that this actually could slow down development of technologies, that this actually could push things to the right that maybe don't really need to be pushed to the right.
I think it's always a matter of scale. So here, there will have to be a balancing act, because maybe some capabilities you will want to have absolutely, or at least for some years. You will have an integration capabilities. Can you really develop every single components up to the end on a national level without sufficient scale and volumes? That may not be economical, or even more than economical. That may not be, that may not make technologic sense, because you can't spend enough on R&D, progress, test, have the right level of quality, insurance, etc. if you don't have sufficient volumes. That's also the industry play to build quality insurance through volumes and testing and technology. So I think what is a challenge as well for space is also very much we are at a time of technology disruption. Technology disruption means you challenge all of the past established leadership and things, how they get organized, plus security obviously playing a big role, but somehow you have to develop new things, and maybe you may be in a position to take leadership in some of the new capabilities, which is what very many countries have been trying to do, supporting national champions and startup, etc. The truth is that somehow the industry will have to partly consolidate, and for certain component systems, etc., there will be champions, and there can't be champions in every single country in the world because there is just not the volume for it. So for sure, there will have to be some compromises, some trade-offs in terms of what's the acceptable thing you want to have absolutely, and where you just have to recognize that maybe you don't have the scale, so you'd better leverage a third party or partners where access is good enough for you.
Going to that, I mean, we've seen that Europe is in a very good position to continue to nurture its ecosystem. It has a regional government, right? The European Commission. You've got ESA, but other parts of the world that I know that you're very involved in, such as Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia. I'm not sure that they have the same sort of regional sort of ecosystems that would support that push for sovereignty. But do you think that is the way that would go?
I think, it depends on nations. For example, in the Middle East, you see some nations very eager to localize some of the production. And some of them, given the investment capability, size, or willingness to develop some constellation, may have the ability to do it, not in every part of the space domain, but in some that they consider more critical. In some other nations, certainly there are more buyers or trying more at the academic level to bring the level of knowledge, technology, etc. to the next level. So it is still possible that for certain types of components, or maybe to build some user terminals, some of those countries may be able to take some position. The fact they can build an entire supply chain seems completely out of reach. But I think, and it's also an interesting question for the Artemis program, for example, you have the Artemis Accord. You want all the countries to be attached to the program and to contribute. So you need also to find a way. Would it be just experiments, R&D, or more academic, or really some specific things you may want to develop because that contributes to local technologic development? So there will be a need to find a path, and industry in the past. There are some passive components or equipment that maybe someday having a supplier in another country could be great. Some of the capabilities you don't want, or you will not find the right skill there. So, and progressively, again, as some of the technologies mature, or some of the goods, there will have to be a form of distribution. But somehow, what's also true, space is important for many nations. The barriers to entry have come a bit lower still if you want to load for small satellite and others. But I think every nation willing to leverage space is also keen on supporting the development of their use of their technologic age or their academic capabilities and so forth. So there has to be also a bit of a technology path going along with the use of space and having a plain space for those nations. So, and again, every single country really very much has its own journey, and some are about reaching the moon. Some others are really about how am I to do my border surveillance or prevent myself from those floods or whatever impacting, or how to make sure that food security, that is my primary concern. Am I going to have enough rice and crops for the next season? And that is very critical also for social stability, for development of the country. So again, space, the beauty of space is it has an impact on most of things on Earth, and economies and social impacts in addition to science and security. The challenge of it is touches many things, so everybody has to find his own path in that game.
Just want to say that we are running out of time, but there's two questions that I really, really, really want to get through that I think are interesting and very particular to Novaspace. You advise governments, you advise investors, commercial operators, and they're sometimes competing with each other, right? So I want to know how you manage that, because you have competing interests that you advise. And I know that you want them all to do well, because if they do well, then you do well, kind of thing, right? But yeah, how do you juggle that?
For sure. So at any company, we also have our rules in the game. So first, at a given point in time, we would certainly weight any conflict of interest and not to enter into certain of them. We would obviously decide to work or not with certain nations and so forth, as depending on, let's say, a like-minded or friendly nations and so forth. So there are obviously first a set of rules that we look at before engaging with any client. So that being said as well, given our size today, we have also the ability to do some firewalls or separate some teams, etc. So and in a timely manner. I mean, every single piece of information remain really proprietary or any type of program. And that's where we may decide if we work long-term with one organization, then okay, that may limit what we can do with certain other players in the exact same activity. Or if we work for a nation, do we work with the neighbors in exactly the same time of stakes? Possibly not. So it's a matter of time management somehow, and on the project as they come, and on the teams we'll allocate to those projects. But it's certainly something that is a high concern to us. And at the end of the day, matters is to deliver the best of what we can do for one client at the time of the engagement up to the end, and on very clear and transparent terms. I can tell you there were several financial transactions in the past where we were approached by several parties, and either we were fully transparent. Okay, do you accept that we work with parallel teams, fully separate, etc., or not? So we had from time to time to be transparent with the client, which has been our way of doing as well, to make sure we manage those conflicts. That being said, it's also an industry where, yes, it's about conflict, but including on the government side, it's also an international landscape where also countries are to work together, and supporting one can also partly support the others. And obviously, large part of it is still civilian. Security is different matter in each case.
And lastly, just to wrap this up and put a bow on this fantastic global discussion, you are in a position that almost nobody else in the industry occupies. You see inside strategies of governments, agencies, commercial operators. As I said earlier, 60 countries, possibly more, haven't kept track. Sorry. What I want to know, though, is have the asks or the tasks that your customers have come to you with, how have they changed in the last 12 months? Because a lot has changed in the last 12 months.
Oh, sure. No, but if I try to give a few examples, so certainly we do a lot more in the defense and security space that we did some years ago. And on the one side, that's one case certainly, and it's more and more operational. And again, with time horizon that have changed, so the type of request may change as well in terms of what do I need or what the right options for me in that particular context. Another thing, for example, direct to device from space has been a big topic. I can tell you, we never did as much work for telecom operators, MNOs, as we did in the last 12 months to 18 months, as that ecosystem looking, okay, what space can do? Is it a threat? Is it a partner? Is it an investment topic for us? And this, I think, in that time of disruption, what we have internalized and what we see more and more required is a combination of more management, but also technology consulting, as a lot is about understanding the technology or be able to even do simulation of what we can do to really a good grasp of what this can do, and then what it means in terms of possible commercial, strategic play where that fits in the ecosystem. And so what we see is more and more that type of request coming hand in hand. And the other part is ecosystem has come larger. So how do you build platforms, if you're on the government side, to be able to leverage those capabilities? So the various form of portal platforms, how to acquire capabilities, meta operators are topics that we see more and more coming, because can you deal with all the ecosystem direct? Do you have filters? Do you have portals you need to build to access to those capabilities? So it's also some of the things we've seen more in demand and changing.
Pacôme, thank you so very much for making the time to come on the podcast.
No, thank you so much, Laura, for first inviting me to be a contributor, and looking forward to do that again, maybe in a shorter time frame than last time we spoke.
Yeah, let's do that.
Thank you.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.